Good morning, Bucketeers. Welcome to the Bucket Courses. I'm Joanne Bundy, and in addition to reminding you to silence your cell phone and turn on your tea coil, I have a couple of announcements this morning. First of all, you'll notice that you have the opportunity to fill out evaluation sheets, which are on your tables this morning. Of course, it isn't a requirement, but our planning committee is always trying to make the bucket courses better, and you have been our absolutely best resources for accomplishing that. So we appreciate anything you have to say about this course, about the bucket courses in general, anything at all that you'd like us to know. And you can fill it out if you wish, and just leave it on the table in the hall, either during the break or after class. The other thing is that next week is Open Wednesday, and for those of you who are new, Open Wednesday is a one-class lecture, and there's no registration and no tuition. You just come and have a good time. And we're going to have a good time next week because one of our fortnightly speakers is going to be here, Howard Rafferty. And he is going to talk about engineering mistakes. And the title of his lecture is so delightfully named, Oops. So he will be here next week. And the Mayflower will have our special treats next week, and it will be the last class of our fall session. Then we have the holidays, and we will begin bucket courses again on Wednesday, January 11th. And you'll be really happy to know that Clark Lindgren is going to be doing our first class after the holidays. But right now, we have the last class of Gene Ketter's course, which is Disabilities and Being Human. Please welcome again Professor of Education at Grinnell College, Gene Ketter.
Is the sound better? A little bit higher? A little bit better? I guess I need to talk more, huh? Is that okay? If you can't hear me, please raise your hand. It's good, Eric says. Okay, good. Well, we have a little bit of a problem, and I have to operate from my own computer here, so I'm going to be really tied to the forward button. But the main theme of today's talk is going to be alternatives to teacher-proof instruction, and I'm going to explain to you what teacher-proof instruction is and why it is. And then I'm going to offer you some alternatives to that approach that I think are more humane, more effective, and better for everybody in the classroom, including kids who've been labeled with disabilities. But first, I wanted you to think about these things as I'm talking while you watch the short film that I'm going to show you, and on into the future. These are what we would call big questions or essential questions in a class. They're questions that there's no simple answer to, but thinking about them is important, especially considering the circumstances of today. So I want you to think about the purposes of public schooling before we finish this lecture, but as I said, I want you to keep thinking about them. Questions are, why are public schools important in the U.S.? They are really a unique institution. Most countries don't have a public school system like ours. How are public schools connected to democracy? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that when I talk about alternatives to teacher-proof instruction. What role, if any, do public schools have in maintaining a just society? What role, if any, do public schools have in creating an appreciation for difference in culture, language, and ability? And what role, if any, do public schools have in teaching us to care for one another? I'm going to go back and review just a little bit to sort of set the stage for what I'm going to do today. I already talked about this with you last week, but I was in sort of a hurry to finish, and so I thought I would just go back and hit the main points. The idea of research-based teaching is scientific in the sense that the experiments that are the basis of research-based instruction are those quasi-experimental experiments that I explained to you last week, where you have a control group and a treatment group, and then you compare results using statistical analysis. These quasi-experimental designs are very difficult. There are all sorts of what we call in psychology threats to validity, because kids grow at different rates, develop at different rates. Kids leave classrooms and come back to classrooms. Like I said, as I said last week, teachers learn the treatment, but of course no treatment is delivered by one teacher the same that another teacher delivers it. And interestingly enough, if this occurs in a school, the kids that are in the control group start to learn about what the kids in the treatment group are getting, and so the kids start talking to each other. So it is a very difficult beast to handle, and it is, as I said last week, about the only source of education research right now, because it's what gets funded by the government. So the idea of ethnographic, remember the book that I told you about, ability profiling, where the woman went into the classroom and she was helping with a science project, but she ended up sort of taking on this little boy, Jay, and trying to understand how it was that he was being disabled by the teacher. That's what we call ethnographic research. And that kind of research is not valued by the current granting agencies in the federal government and in most states. So it's just important to understand that's where this is coming from. I'm going to give you an example of one of these research-based instruction plans. It's called Reading First. It was actually included in the No Child Left Behind law, and IDEA mentions it as well. It's a $1 billion granting program that was endorsed by the No Child Left Behind law and by IDEA as a research-based program. So meaning that the practices that Reading First recommends came out of these quasi-experimental kinds of research. Millions of dollars were distributed to each state if they chose an approved Reading First program. So the states would write a grant and say, we're going to do this kind of reading instruction in our school, and if the federal government approved it, they'd get millions of dollars to pay for the instructional materials. Reading First is basically what we call direct instruction. Now, some of you who are elementary teachers know about the phonics and whole language war. It really is kind of a war. But the Reading First is definitely phonics based. It has a definition of reading that I don't find very convincing. So the reason, when you want to do an experiment, let's say I want to know if this particular reading strategy works, helps kids learn to read, you do this quasi-experimental design, again, where you use the treatment on some kids and you don't on the other, and then you compare the results. But in order to do that, you have to decide what is reading. How do I operationalize it, is what it's called. In other words, I have to be able to measure it, right? I can't just say the kid is reading. I have to break it down into its little parts. So I break it down into phonemic awareness, into phonics, and I'll talk about those in a minute, vocabulary, fluency, which means basically how well does a child read aloud. So it's a very, I believe, very narrow definition of reading. Comprehension is in there, but it's just one thing, and there's nothing else about what reading does for us. Does a child learn to empathize? Does a child enjoy reading? Does a child find himself in the text? Does the child want to share the book with someone else? Those kinds of things, the things that I think are a part of reading, can't be operationalized, it can't be quantified, so they're not counted in the definition of reading. And this is in the IDA law too. Now the whole language approach, which is sort of the opposite of the direct instruction, looks at reading as this very complex activity that is best done in a rich literacy environment. So in direct instruction, there are books, and I know I've seen some of these books in the Grinnell system. They are books that are designed, so for example, you decide well, this child needs to learn blended letters like SH and CL and those kinds of things. Well, then the book will have a certain number of those words in the book. But these books, in my opinion, are not real books. They're not stories. Lots of times they don't even make very much sense. They're just practicing these blended sounds. Lots of times the illustrations are kind of awful because they're made on the cheap. And compared to these beautiful picture books and wonderful books that are out there for children, these are not what I would call high-quality literature. So they don't really engage the kids very much. They give them practice in pronouncing clam. So there might be a picture of a clam and a clock and a cloud. And it might say, see the clam, see the cloud, see the clock. No story, nothing, just there's a picture and you're learning to blend those sounds. But whole language says, okay, let's put the kids in this rich environment where the teacher is reading books to them. If you've ever seen those big books where the teacher has a huge copy of the beautiful book, reads it to the children are reading books, the children are reading books to each other, the children are reading books to the teacher. Now this doesn't mean the whole language, anti-whole language people say, oh, you know, it's terrible because there isn't any phonics. But that's not true. Whole language uses phonics. They teach kids the sounds of letters and blended letters, but they do it in this richer environment where kids are enjoying reading, where they're learning about the world, where they're learning to empathize. Back to this purposes of schooling, where they're learning about different cultures, they're learning about different views of the world. Instead of clock, cloud, clam. The other thing that really bothers me about this whole direct instruction are these things called lexile scores. Those of you who know what they are may feel the same as I do. So what happens is there are all sorts of different tests that we use in this Reading First program, but you measure the child's reading level using, sometimes there's a Dibble test, there are other tests out there, but they would measure all these things. Fluency, how well does the child read aloud? Word attack skills, which is phonics. Does the child know that CL goes club? You know, does the child know how to pronounce clock? Does the child seem to understand what the text is about? Which would be hard with clam, clock, and cloud, but you know. So anyway, once the child's reading level is established, and usually it's just a number or it could be a color, you're a level blue. The premise is the child should not be reading out of that lexile level. So the classroom will have all sorts of books at different levels for the children and say, Sarah, you're blue, so you read in the blue section. And if Sarah wants to read something easier or something harder, she's discouraged from doing so. In whole language, we don't do that. In whole language, the child can pick up a book and the teacher can say, that's a pretty difficult book, you might have some trouble with that, but I want to try it. Sure, go ahead, try it, see if you like it. Or the child can pick up a book that the teacher knows is too easy for the child. And kids do this a lot. Kids read a lot of books that are too easy for them. It's pleasurable. There's no challenge, but they still, lots of times they have positive emotions associated with those books. They're just relaxing to read something that isn't a challenge all the time. Kids like to read. In fact, I have to say this in my dissertation work. I was working, my topic was portfolio assessment in English classes. But I was talking to the students about their experiences reading, because one of the things they were doing was reading AP level course literature. And I was talking to them about which books they liked. Finally, I asked this one student, I said, well, she's a senior in high school, what book did you really enjoy reading this year? She just looked at me and said, none. I said, what's the last book you really remember enjoying reading? And she got really excited. She said, Socks by Beverly Cleary. I loved that book when I was a kid, and I just found it the other day, and I went back and read it again. Well, you know, that's what kids do. Well, if you're not reading at your lexile level, it's a problem. So this sort of scientific approach to reading, to me, I think is problematic. All right, so, I have to do it here, don't I? Sorry. Reading first. Uh-oh, there's a scandal. I love scandals, okay. The Inspector General found a conflict of interest in Reading First. So the man Doherty, who was directing the program, was accused of ignoring conflicts of interest and actively seeking to favor particular texts with particular companies. So what happened was Doherty created a panel to look at Reading First materials. What would be acceptable if the state wrote a grant and said, I want to use these materials? The panel would decide whether or not the state would get the grant. Well, the panel was, shall we say, loaded with people who believed in direct instruction. And they found emails from Doherty saying, don't put any whole language people on that panel. And if there are any whole language people, shut them up. So it was clear that he deliberately biased the panel so that they would choose a particular kind of texts or particular programs. And there was an expose written in the Washington Post talking about how the states were forced to choose from these supposedly peer-reviewed textbooks. If they tried to choose anything else, they didn't get the grant. What the states did was they hired consultants. They said, help us figure out how we're going to get this money. Well, guess who the consultants worked for? The textbook companies. So they're in all of the Reading First program. There's something like, I think, 4,800 schools. They use 3 different texts. And the same thing for the assessment. So if you look at this text, the commercial interests behind these textbooks and programs have paid royalties and consulting fees to the key Reading First contractors, who also served as consultants for states seeking grants and chaired the panels approving the grants. So this is just a way of making money, basically. Now, I'm not saying that Doherty didn't believe that direct instruction was the way to go, but he clearly did not make it a fair process. And then, to top it all up, Reading First doesn't work very well. So, another proven method, well, these proven methods, or these teacher-proof methods, are aimed at what I would say teacher-proofing. So, in other words, we have this belief in our country, IDA and NCLB seem to have made this assumption too, that teachers are not well prepared. Schools of education, my gosh, you should have heard the early 2000s, they were so excoriated. It was, I work at a teacher education program. We were not doing a good job at all. We were just turning out anybody, and our teachers were terrible, and there were all sorts of studies that proved this. So what do you do? What do you do if you have all these bad teachers out there? That's why this test scores are low, and that's why students aren't learning. So they said, well, here's what we do. We make sure that teachers who are going into a program, students who want to be teachers, have to take a literacy test. We test in lieu of getting a license, which I don't really have any problems with, except that sometimes somebody can just take the test and get a license, and they haven't had any schooling at all. There's Teach for America, that's a long story. But in the whole, but they had 5 weeks of training in the summer. But the whole result of this is deprofessionalizing teaching. It's making teachers, it's constructing teachers as not knowing what they're doing. And it's not good for students either. So, because one of the responses is to use scripted curriculum. Now, a scripted curriculum, they actually have this in Grinnell. And I don't want to be too critical of Grinnell schools because I think they do a wonderful job. But I really have problems with scripted curriculum. So if we have bad teachers and they don't know what they're doing, well, let's just give them a script to follow. And I'm not kidding. It's a script. You say this. Children do this. I mean, it's literally a script that teachers are supposed to read from when they teach. This is my example. I was working with a teacher in the 7th grade, and she was a very good teacher. I'd gotten to know her pretty well. She's teaching 7th grade, and like I said, I'm not trying to cast aspersions on Grinnell Middle School. It's just an experience I have. This is going on all over the country. They had bought a scripted curriculum for reading because the reading scores on the NCLB, for the tests for NCLB, were lower than they needed to be, or lower than we wanted them to be. And the theory was, well, if we have the teachers use these direct instruction methods for reading, then our reading scores will go up. So this teacher was a wonderful teacher. She'd worked a couple of years trying to align the curriculum with what we call the Common Core. And I was in her classroom, thought she was doing a great job. In the back of her room, she had the new materials. Now this particular group of materials was from a nonprofit, but a lot of them are not nonprofit. And these materials were on paper, and they were what we can say consumables. So the students were writing in them and using them up. And this was in a classroom where everybody had a laptop. I have a problem with that. The first thing I picked up, the non-fiction texts are big in the Common Core and now in the Iowa Core. So it was a non-fiction article written in 1994, I believe, and it was about school uniforms. Well, first of all, these kids weren't even born in 1994. Secondly, school uniforms is not a relevant issue to Grinnell middle school kids. It's just not. Why, when they had a laptop sitting right there, could they not look up an article that they were interested in, that was at their reading level, that they could process and understand and do all the kinds of things that they're supposed to do with those nonfiction texts? But they already had computers. I looked at a math, well, so here's what one of the teachers, I think he was talking about Success for All. That's one of the reading programs that Reading First would accept. It was clever marketing, really. The district presented it as a time-saving device, as if being teacher-proof was a good thing. Yet most teachers I know would rather have academic freedom and the opportunity to teach to the student than save a few hours a week and feel like a McDonald's burger flipper. And I looked at a set of descriptive curriculum for math, and I just looked at some of the prices, and a set of 30 little, they were just kind of thin little bound books, consumables again, for students, $1,140. That was just one set of problems or one theory or concept that kids are supposed to get. So you can imagine schools are spending, well, millions of dollars on these scripts. And they make differentiation and flexibility very difficult, obviously. If you're teaching from a script, it's one size fits all, right? Every child is going to do this, every child is going to do this now, and it's not very engaging. So this is, I believe, what has come out of this sort of scientific approach to teaching. And it really does go back to the medical model. This idea that we have a problem, we diagnose it, and then we treat it. As opposed to being in a classroom with children, enjoying them, reading with them, helping them learn. It's become very sterile and also teacher-proof. So I have an alternative. I'm not just going to complain, I'm going to say I think we should be doing something else. It's a little bit radical. I think we should eliminate tracking, create multiple ability classrooms. I think we should create relevant lessons that actually build on students' multiple strengths. I think we should give students choice in how they learn material and how they demonstrate that they have learned it. I think we should ground the curriculum in the community. I don't think we need universal ideas. We need, like the uniform thing. Didn't have anything to do with our students. We could have done something with our students that mattered in their community. Design assessments that emphasize growth over time rather than selecting and sorting, ranking and sorting. And provide experiences that help students see all differences as positive. So those are sort of the overarching ideas that I have for how teaching should work in classrooms that would not disable anybody. What's wrong with tracking? Tracking is so obviously common sense, right? It's everywhere. It's in grade schools, it's in ability grouping, and in high schools, it's in tracks. Even though, remember the Hobson-Hanson case, it has been found to be inequitable. So here are some underlying assumptions of tracking. That putting slower children with brighter children will slow the brighter children down. But there's no evidence that that's true. People have been doing studies for years trying to prove this. Actually, they stopped doing studies in about the 90s because they couldn't prove it. But it just seems so common sense, right? If you put all the bright kids together, they're going to raise each other up, and then you can put one of the theories I heard was, well, then the slower kids are going to rise too because they don't have those brighter kids to compete with, and they're going to that doesn't happen, okay? Lower children do better in heterogeneous classrooms, and bright children don't do any worse. It doesn't pull them down. There's a book by Slavin that was written in, I think in 1990, which was the last thing that I always look for this stuff because I want to argue with people at the elementary school. But he did a synthesis of research, probably 20 or 30 studies, and he said it has zero effect to put people in tracks. They're going to perform like that in a heterogeneous classroom, the brighter kids. But the good thing is that the kids that are struggling do better. So this tide raises all the boats. And their idea is, oh, slower children need more drill, they need more skill building. And this is something that I've talked to my colleague and friend Martha Boyles about. She was a math instructor, taught people how to teach math. And she said one of the things that really bothered her was that elementary students who were inaccurate in their addition and subtraction, and they go too fast, or maybe they wrote numbers they couldn't read, or something like that, were put back and made to do more and more and more addition. When it wasn't that they didn't understand addition, they did, they were just kind of sloppy. So then the next year they have to do addition again, and then the next year maybe they get to move up to subtraction, while the rest of the kids are doing pre-algebra or something. And she said it's not that they don't have the concepts, it's just that they are a little bit sloppy. The interesting thing is, if you get kids challenging problems where the addition has to be correct in order to solve the problem, they do better. So Martha was always advocating for moving kids along and giving them real problems to solve so their solutions actually mattered, where it wasn't just a list of math facts. Putting these math problems in context where, I love something that Tammy at the middle school, somebody told me her name, Tammy Strasser, does at the middle school with the kids in her class. She was a special ed teacher, and I think she does a wonderful job of differentiating instruction. But in her math class, she has all the kids build a zoo. But there are all these problems. So like the elephants can't be within 20 feet of the lions. And the lions like to be next to the giraffes, because then they can watch them or pretend like they might hunt them, I guess, I don't know. But anyway, and so the kids design these zoos, but they have to get the dimensions correct. They have to make sure that they've protected the animals and that they've allowed enough space for the animals. So they have to do geometry, they have to do proportions, they have so much space that they have to use. It's a great real use of math, and the kids do it because they want the zoo to work. But if she just gave them a bunch of proportion problems, lots of kids would probably get them incorrect. And the conclusion would be that they don't understand it, when they really do. So I think the idea that kids need rote learning, the slower kids need rote learning, it's just such a deadly thing, because then it just grows and grows, and the school gets more and more boring and more disengaging. And instead of these kids being caught up in education, they really they don't like school, and then they drop out. Every kid deserves challenging, engaging, and real problems to be involved in at the appropriate level. Every kid deserves that. You shouldn't have to wait until you get all your math facts perfect. So the last one is we should spend our resources on the kids who really matter the most, right? Because they're the ones who are going to be, well, I will say president, or, do something great in the world. And the problem with that, at its core, is it's undemocratic and it's elitist. So even if it worked, I wouldn't be in favor of it. But the fact that it doesn't work and it's unethical, I think it should be. That's what's wrong with tracking. Gifted education without gifted kids. I like this idea, because if you get rid of tracking, you don't have gifted kids anymore, right? Your gifted kids are mixed in with all the others. As I said, every child deserves a challenging, engaging, and relevant curriculum. And the sorts of activities, ironically, that we do in gifted ed are great for everybody. Now, of course, they have to be differentiated, but project, problem-based curriculum is wonderful, because it engages everybody in real problems, hopefully problems that actually affect the community of the school, or the classroom, or the larger community of the city or town. They should have choice in topics. Kids in gifted, and even when they're 6, get to decide what they want to research. They get to do creative expressions. Anybody hear Olympic of the Mind, and then it was Odyssey of the Mind, or first it was Odyssey and then it went Olympic. That was something that gifted education teachers did, where kids made up plays and they did logic problems. Well, those are the kinds of things that every kid should be able to do. An emphasis on personal goal setting. When my daughter, she was a gifted kid, I used to tell her that, and a dime would get her a cup of coffee. She was in a gifted class, and she did her own, and this was at a time, and I don't think it's true anymore in Kansas, but gifted education was mandated. Every child who was deemed gifted had to have an IEP, just like a special ed kid. It was considered special ed, but it was really special ed. And so she made up her own IEPs. She just did them herself. from the time she was like 11. Then also this underlying belief that the child is special gets communicated to the child. The child thinks he or she is special because she is gifted. But multiple ability classrooms are different because they build respect for everybody, for different ways of learning, for different ways of understanding the world, for different ways of coming at problems, and they de-emphasize competition, which actually, there's lots of evidence that competition in a classroom decreases learning. How many, do I have 9 more minutes?
Yes.
Okay. I mentioned this just in passing, the understanding by design, UDL, universal design for learning, sorry. There are all sorts of acronyms in education. This is based on, as I told you, I think very early on, based on the architecture idea of universal design, where if you make a building accessible to everybody, people who use wheelchairs, parents with strollers, kids on skateboards, whatever, you're making it more accessible to everybody. So the idea is with UDLs, if we make curriculum accessible to people with learning difficulties, we're really making the curriculum more accessible to everybody. So what does UDL say? It's very based on technology. It uses a lot of technological ideas to help students do well in the classroom. So one of the things that they say is that you should give students various entries into the text, because there are all sorts of ways to get into material, right? You can watch a video, it could be read to you, you could read the text with visual help. There are just all sorts of ways to help kids get into the curriculum other than saying, read chapter 17. You allow students to collaborate and help each other. It isn't about competition, because this is the way the real world works. Nobody in his job or her job sits there and says, you're not going to help me, I've got my thing covered up and you're not going to help me because I have to get this done and I don't want any help at all. Nobody does that, but we do that in school. We work together to solve problems. That's how problems get solved, because everybody has different skills and brings different ideas to the problem. We focus on mastery. In other words, you set a goal and you try to get closer to that goal, not competition again. You design authentic, engaging activities, and you highlight big ideas, essential questions, the kinds of things that can actually move through a curriculum for many grades. There was a small school idea, Deborah Meyer started one in New York, where one semester, the whole semester, they had several big questions, and every grade, 1 through 6, was thinking about that question. And then assessment, UDL assessment is that you allow students multiple ways of expressing what they've learned. Not everybody has to take a multiple choice test. Not everybody has to write an essay. If you're trying to figure out what the kid understands, what the child has learned, you need to give that child a different way of expressing it. Unless you're trying to teach him to write an essay, then obviously he needs to write an essay. But we are so essay dependent when there are other ways of showing teachers what we understand. And we promote the use of the student's own dialects, African American language, ASL. In other words, we honor where that child comes from. And if the child wants to wrap his understanding, well, think about Hamilton, right? If you want to wrap your understanding of that math problem, why not? And we build in opportunity for failure. And I like this, it's so important. You construct failure as inevitable, it is, and it's a part of learning. So failure is not punished. You try something, you don't do well, you don't get an F. You try something, you don't do well, you get some feedback, and you try again. That's the way it should work. And then you explicitly, you talk out loud about what the kids bring to the table. All of them, not just the bright ones. And I'm going to talk really quickly about testing because I really am, this is my area, this is what I really have done a lot of research in, but I'm not going to take too much time. I'm just going to say the problems with testing. We test a lot in this country because we're trying to compare one school to another, and that No Child Left Behind. We just love testing. Remember IQ testing? We love testing in this country. What is wrong with testing is that in order to test something, we have to reduce it. We have to reify it. We have to make it measurable, like with reading. We have to break it into 5 components. And when you reduce something, you actually lose something. When you reduce a complex activity or behavior or concept into its little constituent parts, the sum is always more than those parts. And what we don't do very often is try to measure those things that we really care about, because they're really hard to measure. We use testing to separate kids. We construct students as something that we are operating on when we test them. They're being measured. We test necessarily by secret, and we don't give people the reasons that they missed tests. I found this out last year. If you take the ACT and SAT, you have to pay a fee to find out which questions you missed. Does that make sense to you? You have to pay a fee. And you have to fill out this form. And that doesn't even tell you why you missed the question. That just says you missed this question on, I don't know, vocabulary. It may not even give you that much information. And finally, testing serves the examiner, the institution. It doesn't serve the child. So what I want is assessment. Assessment literally means to sit by somebody and help them. It is messy, complex, and it is not objective. It can't be. It's human judgment. Assessment measures progress toward a goal. See how this works with a kid who's been labeled with a disability? So much better than testing. Here's your goal. How are you getting there? Let me help you. That's what we do in assessment. John Dewey said, nobody has any business, John Dewey, great progressive educator, no business trying to compare one child to another. Why would we do that? We're comparing the child to what he wants, what he needs to know. We're helping him get there. Assessment is transparent. Everybody knows what they're being assessed on. They know the criteria. And in my classes, my students help me build the criteria. They say, this is what we think we should be assessed on. And finally, the person learns from the assessment. It's useful to the person, because then maybe that person can improve what he or she is doing. All right, I'm going to skip to my last slide. This is me. I'm going to wax poetic, as I told you. I have this idea of loving the learner, and I tell my students, you're not going to love all your students. Some of your students are really going to annoy the heck out of you. That's okay. But what you need to be fascinated by is, how are they learning? How is their brain working? How is this going? I mean, why is this kid able to do this and this kid able to do that? And just appreciating the complexity and lovely differences that your children bring to the classroom. We need smaller classes and in humane environments. That means that kids get to go outside, kids have recess, kids have music, they have art, they can play at a sand table, they can dress up, they can do all sorts of things in elementary school. Maybe, I don't know, why not middle school too? Students have autonomy. This is very important in the concept of critical pedagogy. Students can decide what they're going to do, and they're going to choose how they are going to learn it. Much of the curriculum would be problem-based. All students would work together. There wouldn't be any tracking. Students would participate in all parts of the school. So this is what I mean by democracy. Not student council, which most kids will admit is just sort of faux democracy, but they're actually making decisions about who gets hired. They evaluate their teachers like they do at Grinnell College. They have autonomy. They might help with the budget. I mean, there are all sorts of ways kids could learn about democracy and what it means to run a school if they were actually involved in it. Curriculum would be based in the community's problems. Schools would be inviting places for the public. Everybody should be welcome. Maybe they could be used on weekends for something else. And finally, testing would be very infrequent, if at all, and assessment would be continual. So that's my idea, that's my alternative to the scientifically based teaching and the teacher-proof teaching that I've been talking about. So I'm going to end there. I'm going to switch over to a film. The film is an Academy Award-winning short documentary called Educating Peter. And so while you're taking a break, I'll switch it over, and the film is about 30 minutes, so we may end a little bit early. That's fine with me if it's fine with you, but I can also, if you want me to talk about the film, I can do that too. I think about those questions that I posed at the very beginning, the questions about what is school for when you're watching this film, and thinking about this kind of idea of loving the learner and critical pedagogy. If that classroom reminds you of that kind of place, then I'm happy, because I think it looks like that to me. Okay, thank you very much. And this won an Academy Award. It takes place probably, I think, 1994 maybe. Remember when the IDA law got renamed to be the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act? There was a stronger insistence on inclusion and not segregating kids with disabilities away from other kids. So the background is that Peter, the main little boy in the story, is going to be included, for this first time, he's been in a special school until now, he's going to be included in a third grade classroom. Let's see if I can turn this off.
Most of you know, the reason we are able to have our tuition in the low category that it is because our professors teach these courses without charging us. And so to make up for that, we want to acknowledge how much we appreciate professors. And I have a certificate for Eugene from our group. Certificate of Appreciation. The Community Education Council gratefully acknowledges the volunteer efforts of Gene Ketter for presenting the bucket course, Disability and Being Human. And thanks, we would donate $50 or $50, $50,000, $50 will be donated to the Art Hyman Book Fund at the Drake Library. We thank you very much, Gene. And next Wednesday is our Open Wednesday, and Howard Rafferty will be here to talk about the engineering oopses. So we'll hope to see you then. Mayflower will have special treats, and we look forward to seeing you all back. Thank you for coming.